Hi everyone, today we're going to be discussing pricing. So to begin our discussion, pricing includes a few different goals for pricing philosophies and strategies. The first goal is one that we come back to over and over, and that's to bring in money and make profit. The second is to meet and stimulate demand. One of the things that's important to understand is that for much of fashion merchandise available in the retail setting, demand increases as price increases. And so if something is priced too low, the customer will see it as cheap or lacking brand appeal. As a price increases up to a point, brand image and perceived value also increase. However, if it rises beyond a certain point, demand begins to decrease because the customer will judge the price as out of line with the perceived value. This actually goes against the typical economic convention that demand changes with price, in that demand increases as price decreases. Another goal is for pricing philosophy to serve as a source of merchandise value assessment. So you need to do this for national brands where the wholesale cost is fixed, and also for private label brands where you're essentially building it from the ground up and have to take into account labor, raw goods cost, transportation, and all of those individualized pieces of building the product. Along this same line, there are some considerations that you have to take when developing a pricing strategy. The first is the composition of the consumer market. So this relates back to your target market. Who are they? How much money are they willing to spend? And how much disposable income do they have? What can they realistically spend? Secondly is the image that the retailer wishes to project. What do you want your customer to come away from the pricing of your merchandise with in terms of a reputation or image about you? So you don't, in this case, want to price things too high. Third is the amount of competition that you face and how your competitors price their merchandise. It's important to remember that your competitors help to set your pricing strategy. And lastly, what are the special pricing needs of any niche merchandise? Is there a really exclusive label that you have, something that's private label, or something that you made an exclusive contract with a designer for? All of this needs to be taken into account. There's also some other questions to consider when it comes to pricing considerations. Will the retailer match the competitor's prices? Will the retailer use coupons or multi-purchase discounts? So will you offer opportunities to use coupons when you don't offer a sale store-wide? Or will you give a discount, for example, buy one, get one free for certain merchandise? Third, will returned merchandise be accepted at the markdown price only if a reduction was taken after the purchase? Typically, a retailer will issue a refund for what you actually paid for it when you have a receipt. But if you don't have a receipt, you'll typically get the reduction price. Fourth, will employees receive discounts on merchandise that they purchase? This is often something that you come across that retailers use to entice employees to wear their store merchandise. And then lastly, will the employee discount apply to sale or clearance merchandise? So that would be 2 discounts that you're applying to merchandise that you want to get out of the way. So do you want to allow employees to wear merchandise that's on its way out? And do you want to allow that double discount? So what are the different ways that you can approach pricing? There are several different strategies that you can use in your retail environment. The first is introductory pricing. So this is when you set prices lower than the industry average markup. And this is particularly true when you have new merchandise that you want to attract customers to. So hence the name introductory pricing. Then you can assess it and decide if you want to mark it up further later when you get other iterations of it or other subsequent collections. The second strategy is price skimming. This is when you set an initial high price, and then this is usually done through a high markup. You then proceed to gradually lower the price so that it sort of evens out in the end. The initial markup was higher than you might have generally used, but as you lower it, it'll still even out more or less. The third is price lining, which is also known as all-in-one pricing. This is when you group inventory into categories, setting the same price for all items in each category. And this results in a below average markup for some items, but others may be at above average. So this is another measure that helps your pricing to even itself out. Fourth is loss leaders. This is when one or more items are sold at or below cost with little to no markup in order to attract customers. So for example, with loss leaders, even if you have lots of merchandise that you might want to sell that's above cost, you may still want to, for example, offer graphic t-shirts at a loss at your clothing store, but then sell the jeans, shoes, and accessories to people who come in for the advertised deal on the graphic t-shirts. Other pricing strategies include product line pricing. So this includes using merchandise with differing price points to establish price levels. This comes into play when a company normally develops product lines rather than single products, and then you have a price stepping, like a price staircase in effect. So perhaps you have a men's clothing store that might carry men's suits at 3 different price levels. You might sell one suit at $800, another at $1,500, and another at a whopping $4,500. The customer will then associate low, average, and high quality suits with those 3 different price points. And so your task as the retailer is then to establish perceived quality differences that justify the price differences. Another pricing strategy is geographical pricing. This is when the retailer decides how to price merchandise based on different locations. So customers in a different region of the United States or in different countries may have to assume higher prices for merchandise to cover higher shipping costs, for example, or a lower price might be put in effect to win additional business at a location that doesn't have very high sales volume. And then lastly here, we have everyday low pricing. So this is the continuous promotional pricing without support of any advertised events or explicit markdowns. So essentially, you are starting out with a low price that will remain, and you won't advertise a sale to bring it down anymore, and it won't incur any markdowns. That is the price it will be, and you're offering that everyday low price to the consumer up front. A couple examples related to loss leaders, and we're going to talk more about examples of pricing strategies later this week. But for loss leaders, you want to attract customer to the store with this strategy. So, for example, when a customer comes into a store, the likelihood that they will see something else to buy is very high. Oftentimes, it can be difficult to strategize this when you have an online retail or e-commerce business. One way that some retailers have approached this is when you go to buy a sale merchandise, that message pops up at the bottom of the screen that says, customers also looked at these products. So this is an example you see on the screen from the JCPenney website. It's a sale shirt that I was looking at, and then below it, it says customers who viewed this item also browsed. These are also sale items, but again, it's enticing you to look at, hey, this is what else we have to offer. There's also the example of unwanted merchandise, and how do you go about using the loss leader strategy to work in your favor here? One of the things that some retailers will do is attract customers in the fall, for example, to shop for back to school clothes by advertising discounts on summer clothes that they want to get rid of. So they're taking a loss on the summer clothes by providing markdowns, but they'll also see the new merchandise that has arrived for back to school fall clothes. A really good example of discussing everyday low pricing is related to the idea of cultivating the sale shopper with markdowns and how JCPenney did this over the last couple of years. So in early 2012, the newly appointed CEO of JCPenney eliminated the long-standing policy of heavily advertising sales for JCPenney. And they called this fair and square pricing. And you can see how this was laid out on the slide there. You have your everyday prices, which was considered that strategy of everyday low pricing. Then you have some month-long values, and then you have best prices. So JCPenney's loyal customers actually didn't really like this because they were already in the habit of purchasing only when there was a sales promotion. So in effect, JCPenney had already cultivated the sales shopper. Consumers really love a good sale. And so this is something that they've known for many years, but this new CEO saw it fit to do something different. The rationale that the CEO took to do this was actually very thoughtful. The problem that markdowns can cause can be tremendous. So if customers come into a store and they look at merchandise and they don't like the price, then they won't buy it. And they might wait to buy it until a markdown happens, maybe 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks down the line. But in the meantime, it sits on the shelves. And your real estate in your store for merchandise is very valuable. So his thinking was, for 6 weeks, not much is happening. You're wasting real estate, you're wasting capital by keeping it there. So he comes in and says, we're not going to play this game anymore. Why not just sell something that would have been marked up at $150 and marked down 6 weeks later to $50 at $50 from the start? Well, he grossly underestimated the strength of consumer shopping habits associated with sales. Many customers actually hated this promotion, and they incurred $985 million in loss over the months that followed. They later reintroduced normal sales and still abide by normal sales to this day. So now let's get into talking about how do you mark up merchandise from wholesale cost, and also how do you conduct markdowns and know when to do that. So let's begin with markups. A markup is how much must be added to the cost of the merchandise to arrive at a selling price that will bring a profit. So markups are derived from a mathematical formula, and the basic formula is retail price minus wholesale cost equals markup. This is also known as initial markup because there's another type of markup that we'll discuss in just a minute. So here's an example for you. If a pair of men's trousers costs $80 at wholesale and it's priced to retail at $150, we take 150 minus 80, and this gives us $70 of markup. So that's how we would translate that. Now, in this case, the buyer purchased the pair of trousers from a vendor for $80 and priced them to sell at $150. They achieved a profit of $70 with this markup. However, this is the best possible scenario for the retailer. In reality, not every item will sell at the initial markup price. So then you need to move on to maintained markup. Maintained markup, the formula is the price that the merchandise becomes after a markdown minus the wholesale cost, and this equals the maintained markup. So using this example, assume that the trousers did not sell and were marked down to $120. So the maintained markup will be 120, which is the price after the markdown, minus the wholesale cost, which was 40 or 80, and that equals your maintained markup. So in this case, the profit is $40 in maintained markup. One of the factors that retailers often have to build into their initial prices is an estimate of how great the eventual markdowns will have to be before the goods are sold. So that's why maintained markup is very important, because if you're always calculating initial markup only, you are shortchanging yourself and setting somewhat unrealistic expectations for your sales volume. So while the dollar markup gives the actual dollars achieved by the retailer once the product has been sold, markups are usually expressed on the cost or retail price. And this is how you use the method of generating the markup percentage based on retail price. So there's a couple of different markup strategies that you can use. The first is a uniform company markup. This is actually pretty rarely used because it doesn't always make sense. So very few retailers will apply a universal markup to each item in their inventory. This is when you apply the same for each item in your inventory. So that could get very uneven if you think about it. And the retailer, if they take this approach, will often determine the cost of running the operation and then apply a markup that covers these expenses with enough left over for profit. This is the simplest approach to pricing merchandise, but the downside, and why it's pretty rare, is that it doesn't account for variables that necessitate different markups for different classifications and items. Then you have markup by classification. So think back to when you did your merchandise management report and how you had your columns of classification, sub-classification, etc. So we're talking about that classification column. This is when department stores and chain store organizations, who most often employ this system, will mark up by classification. And they will choose different markups for different classifications and then carry this throughout their whole operation. This really requires different attention to different types of goods for different types of consumers. And so the separate markups reflect these different costs and different considerations. So for example, Fur coats necessitate better security systems in store, and furniture requires more costly warehousing. And of course, furniture involves the use of textiles. So this means that there's going to be different costs even in housing the merchandise and being able just to make it available to sell, beyond just thinking about who the consumer is for the specific merchandise. Another thing to consider when it comes to markup by classification is that fashion merchandise is often very short-lived, and it has to bring higher prices to make up for lower markup in other areas of a store, such as a department store. So for such a retailer to turn a profit, they have to first assess the overall markup, the minimum markup necessary to be profitable. And then once all of those pricing factors have been assessed, then a specific markup can be assigned to each merchandise classification. This brings us to the idea of keystone markup. So this is a strategy wherein you can uniformly apply without having a uniform company markup. Keystone refers to doubling the wholesale cost to arrive at the retail price. So it's just a simple equation of doubling your wholesale cost to arrive at the price that you will sell the merchandise for. There's also a newer version of Keystone markup called Keystone Markup Plus. This is when you double the cost to arrive at the retail price, but then you add a little extra to maybe account for lower markups in other areas of the store. Lastly, there's markup by item. So buyers are actually able to price certain lines, such as private labels and those that they have arranged for exclusive distributions. They can do this and make higher markup than they normally would, and then price more competitive styles, such as national brands carried by competitors, at a lower markup. And this is another one of those instances where things really start to balance out, because you have some that are higher markup and some that are lower markup. So for example, if you consider a junior sportswear department that features a large variety of items such as sweaters, dress pants, jeans, skirts, sweatpants, some of these items are going to be more competitive than others. And some might require lower markups. So to offset the lower prices, other items within the department will carry a greater markup. So continuing with our discussion of markup strategies, we get to the idea of markup percentage. And we've mentioned this briefly already when we were talking about our markup strategies. But just to walk you through an example, Before your markup percentage can be determined, it's necessary to first find the dollar markup. So that's why we're discussing this last in the grand scheme of strategies. So we already talked about how to find markup in dollar format. To determine the markup percentage based on retail price, the dollar markup price is divided by the retail price. So for example, if we have a sweater that costs $40 in wholesale and it retails for $80, the markup percentage on retail is 50%. So I have my retail price minus my wholesale cost, and that's my markup in dollars, $40. Then I'm going to take my retail markup minus the markup percent based on my retail markup divided by the total retail price, and that equals my markup percentage. Now notice that this is a 50% markup. This is an example of keystone markup because it has been doubled. So make sure that you understand how keystone markup occurs. Next, let's talk about markdowns. Markdowns are the amount of reduction in merchandise price when it doesn't sell at the markup price. So as we talked about, not every item sells at the original marked price, and it might have to be reduced to motivate purchasing and recoup at least a portion of the wholesale cost. So this amount in reduction is known as markdown. And although retailers invest a significant amount of expense and time into planning their model stock, even the best plans have to have adjustments. So some merchandise will be on target and warrant maybe some type of reordering with your liquid capital, and others will fall short of expected sales and might require markdowns. There's two main issues to address when it comes to markdowns. Number one, when to reduce the prices of low sellers. And number two, how much of a reduction should be applied to those items. It's important to remember that markdowns are often necessary to induce your stock turnover. So stock turnover is the number of times that you change your stock during the year, or the time at which you change out a significant portion of your merchandise. And markdowns help to induce that turnover because people will often come and sale shop for it. There's a variety of reasons for markdowns. The first is buying errors. Now, buyers are prone to error, but it's not always necessarily their fault. There is a huge unpredictability in the nature of the apparel and textiles industry. But one thing that buyers might do to overcompensate is to take markdowns too soon if they're trying really hard to right their wrongs. So overbuying, maybe choosing the wrong color palette, choosing an incorrect ratio of designer versus private label brands, and inaccurate arrival of merchandise can contribute to buying errors. So remember, the time at which you put the merchandise out on the retail floor makes a difference in when it may or may not need to be marked down. Secondly, there's management errors. So buyers are often given the majority of the purchasing responsibility, but they're often guided by management when it comes to pricing decisions. There is a position known as a general merchandise manager who will often work with the buyer to guide those decisions. And if a buyer lacks flexibility with a markup percentage, an item might have too high a selling price to motivate the consumer to purchase. A third reason is inadequate sales staff. So perhaps your staff have poor training, you haven't taught them how to work with customers or to be helpful, and the merchandise isn't selling itself. And so without that extra nudge or that extra smile or question to ask if they need help, the customer is not going to go for the merchandise. Fourth, high initial prices. This is when a buyer misjudges the price that a consumer is willing to pay for a specific item. So occasionally, you will adopt a pricing strategy, as we talked about, where you'll price something higher than it should be. And then if the competition charges less for the same item, you may or may not know this ahead of time, but it's not really going to sell because they can get it somewhere else for a fraction of the cost. And this idea of overcharging the customer may be seen as taking advantage and create a negative reputation for the retailer. And then lastly, you have external factors. So even as we've talked about, the very best merchandise mixes and plans and model stock can be carefully advertised and promoted and visually merchandised, and your sales staff might present it very enthusiastically, but it may not make the profit that you had envisioned. That's because there are conditions, such as external factors, that cannot be predicted or avoided. For example, adverse weather conditions are something that plague clothing retailers often. So maybe you have an unusually warm September in a traditionally cold climate that might discourage shoppers from buying snowsuits for their children or coats for themselves. Or maybe you have a rainy, cool summer that doesn't provide enough stimulation for purchasing swimwear. So since the merchandise affected by these conditions is very seasonal, then each day that the weather is off provides less opportunity for selling. So this is another key point, that your customer needs to feel motivated, not only to shop, but to pay the price that you're asking. Other examples are declining economy and national disasters. So we had a declining economy in early 2010, and there were things like food items that weren't really seriously affected. But consumers generally pay less for fashion-oriented items during those types of economic downturns. The same thing happened shortly after 9/11, which would be an example of a national disaster. Given this information, it's necessary then to address, when do you take a markdown? The seasonal nature of fashion and the unpredictability in terms of customer acceptance makes this a very complicated decision. And timing markdowns is one of the few things that is in a retailer's control, and it's critical for success. So first, you want to look at when you plan to, along a calendar timeline, introduce certain merchandise. And that will tell you when it's viable. So for example, back to school merchandise is most viable in July, August, September. So when do you want to plan to take a markdown? Well, probably in late September-ish, early October, maybe even mid-September. There is what's known as a traditional sale period, and this is defined as having semi-annual markdowns, most traditionally around the 4th of July and Christmas. However, in recent times, there has been an adoption of non-traditional sale periods by many retailers, and this is defined as just having more frequent markdowns than a semi-annual markdown. There are a lot of retailers following this strategy for several reasons. The first is that merchandise held too long is going to require more and more markdowns. Secondly, by quickly disposing of less desirable goods, the retailer's turnover rate will improve and then enable the buyer to purchase more fresh fashion options. And third, there will be less room on the brick and mortar selling floor to display the new season's offerings that can be sold at full markup if that space is occupied by marked down merchandise. So you want to get rid of the stuff that is going to not make you as much profit so that you can make room for what will. Even though this is becoming more popular, there are many fashion retailers that still follow the traditional sale period. They argue, first, that too many sale periods put customers on notice, and then they're more likely to wait for a price reduction rather than buy it at retail price. Second, sometimes a hasty decision to lower prices is unnecessary, and so waiting a few more weeks might actually bring you more profit than if you do more frequent markdowns. And lastly, retailers argue that it's better to keep a traditional sale period because during periods of markdowns, more people crowd the store, and this can result in a reduction of customer service. So there's fewer customer service associates to go around compared to the ratio of customers in the store. So once you decide when you might like to take a markdown, then you have to decide on the size of the markdown. To make goods sell faster, first and foremost, it must demonstrate significant savings to the consumer to entice them. So think about this for just a minute. When you go shopping, fill in this blank. Markdowns of less than blank % rarely entice the shopper to buy. What number would you add into that blank? So now that you have a number in your head, the answer, according to research, is 20%. Markdowns of less than 20% are less likely to entice shoppers to buy. So for example, few shoppers would be motivated to buy a dress that originally retailed at $120 that is now being offered for $110. And the size of the markdown is usually dependent on when merchandise is offered in the selling season. So when a buyer wants to motivate coat shoppers, for example, in early October, the discount could be much smaller because it's more of a small little enticement to come into the store during coat season. But the discount that's offered in the middle of January will be larger because this is when the season is coming to an end. The early markdown decision not only affords the buyer a lower markdown percentage, so you're going to lose less profit on the discount, but also it allows for a higher markdown later in the season, so you can do a gradual reduction. Early markdowns usually reflect a savings of around 20%, and then end of the season sales often produce markdowns of 50% or more. So that's often the deciding factor, is when merchandise is being offered for a discount in the selling season. Now let's talk about the mathematical concepts of markdowns. The retailer calculates markdowns as percentages of the new selling price. So to figure out the markdown in dollars, you use the formula that's first on our list here. That formula is original retail price times markdown percent equals markdown dollars. So to walk through an example, A 30% markdown on a dress currently retailing at $80 is computed as follows. 80 times 0.30 equals 24. 24 is the number of dollars that it will be marked down. To determine the markdown percent, the following formula is used. This is going to be markdown dollars divided by current retail price times 100. This equals your markdown percent. To walk through an example, the markdown percent of a $10 markdown taken on a sweater that retails for $50 is computed as 10 divided by 50, in parentheses, times 100. This gives you a markdown percent of 20. Then, to determine the markdown formula for markdown retail price, you use original retail price minus markdown dollars equals markdown retail price. Keeping with the example in the markdown dollars formula, a dress that originally retailed for $80 but has markdown dollars computed at 24 would have a markdown price after the 30% markdown of $56. Those are the basics that you need to know for mathematical formulas with both markups and markdowns.